Thank you. Yeah, thank you for listening to this, everyone. So I've been thinking about this concept of epidemic sovereignty, which I'll come to define in a second, for quite a while now. And I've sort of bucketed my research motivation into three categories. So one is just professional. I worked at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and their bio team on a specialized legal instrument for the United Nations Secretary General to use to launch an investigation into any country in the world to investigate high consequence biological events. I've also worked at Council on Foreign Relations in their global health program. And this was a study on COVID-19 mortality variation. And one of the things that we found there was political determinants have an outsized effect. And then working at other places, including with projects on McKinsey and Harvard, one of the things that became super clear to me was that biosecurity is really impossible to resolve through global policy if you have non-cooperative states. And I find sort of a common through line in my studies. So I finished up an IR undergrad at LSE, followed my international policy postgraduate. And in both of these, my dissertation and its thesis is sort of concentrated on how international law can both constrain or help governance of catastrophic risks. And it becomes quite clear to me that there's this distributional corpus of literature on humanitarian intervention, counterterrorism, rules of war, weapons of mass destruction, but it very rarely intersects with this new literature on global catastrophic or existential risks. Finally, I have some personal motivation for looking at this so-called epidemic sovereignty concept. I did a lot of work on activist organizing, especially in the context of human rights. And it's sort of a very obvious claim to me that governments sometimes do really bad things for no other reasons than they want to. And very structured, logical incentives don't often work for them. And often bigger stakes are required. So then why do I want to focus on states and why do I want to focus on epidemic sovereignty? One of the things that's sort of very clear from the beginning of state sovereignty in political history, and one can sort of debate when that happened, is that states have often been in control of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear being sort of a classic example here. And although that's changing with the democratization of tech, three observations in my mind are quite clear. One, non-state actors, which might have this tech, still operate within states. Second, states still exert considerable impact over the development and production of this tech. And I think nuclear and bio are still helpful examples here. But finally, and this is probably the most critical one, any remedies or mitigation strategies that you would undertake vis-a-vis global policy to mitigate X risk still rely on states insofar as they're the main authority and organizing principle politically. So what are states? And I know that this is on the border of being pedantic, but I think it's important to go through for some of the stuff later on in the presentation. So the definition of a state is oddly contentious, unless you think of some contentious examples. But one of the most consensus definitions of states is through the Montevideo Convention, which simply defines the state as having a settled population, territory, government, and the ability to enter into relations with other states. This seems semi-obvious. I think more importantly, the defining feature of a state is that it has sovereignty, which implies a hierarchy of authority. Very simply put, states can internally do whatever they want without interference from other people. So there's an external and internal component to it. And this external and internal component can be further mapped out into de jure and de facto terms. So de jure simply means it's according to the rules, everyone knows it, and de facto simply means people are doing it, but may not be according to the rules. So Russia might have de facto sovereign control over Crimea, even if it doesn't have de jure control. And some states might be de facto sovereign, even if they're not de jure sovereign, insofar as they don't have international and institutional recognition. So having thought about all of this, why am I working on state sovereignty as a concept? First, I think existential risks are important to focus on. I think the EA community agrees with that, but I do think that excess reduction strategies are often unworkable without some restriction of state sovereignty, concept that perhaps the EA community neglects. So for me, this is how the sausage of an EA policy is made. There's an epistemics angle, just figuring out what you want to do. There's a technical angle, which is doing it. There's a legislation angle, which is enforcing that in the form of rules. And then there's an enforcement angle, which is pushing for legislation to be implemented. My thesis is that the EA community spends almost all of its energy on 1 and 2, sometimes now pushes up for point 3. There's basically no energy or resource spent on point 4. And I think that's a dangerous distribution of resources. And these are the actions that I think the EA community does take when it does do anything about states. So again, we can look at along 4 buckets. So, epistemic, states don't know what to do. The EA community helps them out by giving them the technologies or know how to do it. States don't have enough money to do it. The EA community does capacity building, basically just funds lots of governments. The states know how to do it and have the money to do it. There's some sort of structural incentive that can get them there, and then the EA community might help with incentive building. There's also this category 4 again, which is just non-compliance, which is we don't want to do it because we don't want to do it. And I think this is where the EA community might have to do a bit more work to make a lot of its X-risk policy enforceable. These 2 tables I've shown you are probably going to be the matter of a lot of debate, so I'm happy to go back to them during the Q&A. Yeah, so let's talk about biosecurity specifically then. Obviously, the WHO was criticized immensely for its COVID-19 response. And one of the things that people picked up on was that the WHO did not prevent situations where the denial and action of one state put many other states at risk and harm. And the WHO has undergone through a series of reforms, and this includes the IHR Treaty of 2005. This includes the pandemic treaty being currently legislated. And my observation during my research was that these reforms are unlikely to succeed in capacitating the WHO in preventing, detecting, and responding to pandemics in a timely manner, simply because they suffer from the same deficits as earlier reforms. What is that reform? It's basically that all reforms undertaken by the WHO rely on the notion of voluntary compliance. And if you think about it, this seems like a pretty obvious and pretty fundamental problem in global health governance, because states understand that not only will they not be punished for violating WHO guidelines and principles, but basically they can do whatever they want and come to the WHO at any point, because WHO is compelled to help these states during a pandemic. So there's a huge problem with the structural alignment of incentives. States have also consistently displayed epidemic management behavior, which demonstrates that voluntary compliance is not effective, even judged by their own self-interest. And one can look at this in terms of mortality, infection, economic loss, whatever it may be. For me, all of these problems flow from the central issue that states are currently epidemically sovereign, which is to say that states have sovereign control over their epidemic responses. And I seek to argue here that a different norm underpinning global health governance is needed. So what is epidemic sovereignty then? Epidemic sovereignty, as I said, is just the norm that states have control over their epidemiological policy. And in arguing against it, I'm not saying that the unit of response necessarily of global health policy has to change, but more that the absolute power that sovereignty implies has to be restricted. So while states may still be the first unit of response to pandemics, they now can't necessarily be the only unit to response, and their authority might be limited in certain cases. What cases? This could be cases such as policies recommended by the WHO upon the declaration of a PHEIC, which it declared with, for instance, COVID-19, on things to do with non-pharmaceutical intervention. So like, social distancing, border closures, all of that stuff. It could be policies to do with pharmaceutical interventions, including vaccines, antiviral treatments, other prophylactics. And then finally, outside of a pandemic crisis, this could be policies recommended by the joint external evaluations which take place every few years to improve states' capacities to prevent, detect, and respond to these pandemics. So for instance, if a JEE from country X reveals that they're really, really bad in sector X, then that becomes actionable information in this case. So epidemic sovereignty for me can be sort of distinguished from other forms of sovereignty, which is why I think it's a helpful term to use. So this is different from, for instance, trade sovereignty or economic sovereignty, military sovereignty, and others. And sort of the reason for that is I think having a wholesale discussion on state sovereignty can be misleading. Not only is it very, very incendiary, not necessarily explosive, it just misses trade-off. Like I think the trade-off on environment versus trade-off on trade versus trade-off on human rights are all different. Because what I'm saying here is that epidemic sovereignty is about relinquishment of control. And if it's about relinquishment of control, states think that's a bad thing. So what it's relinquishing control for then needs to be framed as a specific trade-off, which is why I think epidemic sovereignty has to be treated as a different category of examples than, let's say, trade sovereignty. What are the justifications? So most of this, I am hoping that you will agree with. So one, just the mere fact that pathogens don't know borders. So basing our organizing political principle of response on borders seems ill-advised. Secondly, if one state does something bad, it affects other states. And this is even true for states which are responding well. And then finally, as engineered pathogens, as engineered pandemics become significantly more likely, the upshot here isn't just that, like, something like COVID happens. The upshot here is like hundreds of millions of people die because a few states did something stupid, like Trump saying the border wall stopped COVID, or Lukashenko saying if COVID existed, I could see it in the air, things like that. Also, I think there are already a set of restrictions on state sovereignty right now. So what I'm arguing isn't necessarily revolutionary. It's just about shifting the discussion on bio to be had on the same terms that, say, mass human rights violations, which it would be if a pandemic happens, or nuclear, which it would be still analogous to. Also, I don't think it's revolutionary because if you read the mandate of the WHO, like if you were like an alien and dropped onto the planet in 1948, and the first thing you read was the WHO mandate, it would sound like the most powerful organization in human history. So like, if anything, all I'm arguing is the logical fulfillment of the WHO mandate and giving it the tools it needs to fulfill it. And finally, like, I'm happy to concede that sovereignty being lost is a bad thing. I don't want to be one of those proto-global government people because, if you think that's a bad thing, that's a bad thing. But it doesn't mean that sovereignty doesn't exist on a control consequence trade-off. There are lots of implications for this, and I'll take just 30 seconds to go through them. So I'm aware of my time. Firstly, I think the EA community could set up a future of state sovereignty working group, which could be interdisciplinary. They could set up a promising fund for this and organize conferences which look at this problem. I think for global health governance, the United Nations Secretary General could employ a joint assessment mechanism to look at this development. The WHO could be given the mandate to recommend sanctions to the United Nations Security Council. And then the universally enforceable legal right to health may be codified. Finally, its governance, in terms of governance for existential risks, an independent unit within the UN may be set up to investigate concerning tech development across the world. The UN Secretary General could also have a specialized legal mechanism on this. And perhaps we can even have a universal declaration against extinction, akin to the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which enshrines state responsibility against irresponsible technological development and responding to it. So I didn't have time to go through my responses, which I'm happy to cycle back to during the question and answers. But, thank you very much to Dr. Catherine Rhodes, to Devi, the CERI organizers in general, for, helping me think about this for several months and, giving me the space to do it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Hamza. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation. Really, really interesting. I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on whether you think the COVID-19 pandemic is more likely to make this kind of shift in global health governance like acceptable to countries like that have shown that they are like difficult to win round in terms of actually responding to these outbreaks. Like, do you think that they will see the worldwide kind of crisis that's emerged from COVID and think that it's more important to respond? Or do you think that they will be kind of further rooted in kind of a lack of response to these kind of threats?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That's a great question. If you look at the last slide here, this is sort of what I get at. So what I'm trying to say is there's a narrow window of opportunity now. For instance, with the pandemic happening, a lot of countries have become very open to critiquing the WHO. During the pandemic, people like Toby and others pushed for this Our Common Agenda report for the United Nations Secretary General to come out. And in this report, it's explicitly stated, like, we need a futures lab, guys. We need a special envoy for future generations. We need to repurpose a trusteeship council, declaration for future generations. So on the global level, both in terms of access lobbying and then COVID-19, this left definitely a lot of discussion that global government needs to change. I think the issue is no one says in terms of what. So for instance, the INB, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, is setting up the new treaty, right, for pandemics and whatnot. If you go through the 7th page of the working draft, the word accountability isn't mentioned once. And I think that's insane. So I think the issue again is there lots of space to change things? There will be. There'll be 3 different new treaties, there'll be new regulations, but will there be things which actually change something? Well, that I think sort of depends on the efforts of the EA community. So to prevent this from being salad dressing, I think we need to make more of a push, but I think the window still exists, if that makes sense.
Next question from Hannah.
When you were talking about the WHO's response to COVID-19, when you started talking about it, like the first thing that came to my mind was, yeah, like they didn't know what to do. And then I was surprised that this wasn't actually the point. And like, yeah, I think the point was great. But I guess from this, I'm like quite worried that if the WHO does get like more control, then like these big mistakes will just be catastrophic. And like currently it seems like the WHO would be inept at like, yeah, being sure about their decisions being good.
That's a fantastic question. This is the same question that Rasa, who's just leading GPI, asked me 2 days ago in Singapore. And I think the answer to this question is that's, in my opinion, a self-perpetuating critique. So I'll give you an example. The WHO was unclear on masking until late March 2020. And then it's sort of like, it was like, okay, maybe we can do it. Maybe we should do it. Maybe we shouldn't do it. Might be effective, might not be ineffective. Somehow, magically, their confusion was mirrored exactly by the confusion of the CDC in the United States. So the moment the CDC cleared its internal house up in terms of masking, so did magically the WHO. And then the second example here would be the WHO declaring the PHEIC too late, right? It would have declared it much earlier. And I'm like, yeah, just like China could have told the world about it a month earlier and not exerted background political pressure on the WHO. So I think my response to this is a lot of the problems that you see with the COVID response on the WHO can be traced back, in my opinion, mostly to states, either directly by states influencing that policy or by indirectly by states not capacitating the WHO with the resources it needs. So I don't think the WHO inherently screwed up during the pandemic, if that makes sense. And I think where it did, that's further evidence of my thesis that the WHO needs to have a mandate that goes past states doing stupid things. That's sort of my response to critique. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thanks for that. And that, I think we might have time for one more question. Oh my God, there are so many hands. I'll go for someone who's not a CERI fellow. Just change things up a bit.
They were just walking by.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Could only join a little bit later. I just have 2 questions. So first of all, you're going to ask states to have limitations on their sovereignty, which is obviously not in their interest. So how will you incentivize them to do this? And my PhD was on a responsibility to protect, which is a UN norm to protect people against atrocity crimes. Well, there is a UN norm in place since 2005, which is R2P. So we have this norm formally in place, but we still have had the crisis in Syria and Libya, Rohingya crisis in 2017 in Myanmar. So even though we have a formal norm that puts limitations on state sovereignty, we see that these norms are not consistently enforced. So yeah, how will you tackle that problem? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very quick because we're quite short on time, but yes, go for it.
Okay, very quickly. On the R2P, thank you for that question. That's fantastic. Very quickly, the R2P, for people who don't know it, is just an international principle which was introduced in the late 1990s, was enunciated in Brussels in 2005. And all it means is, and I will be doing injustice to someone who's done a PhD on this, is states don't just have sovereignty as an inherent right. It comes with an accompanying responsibility to protect their people. And if they violate that responsibility, for instance, by launching a genocide, a civil war, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, or they let it happen within the confines of their state, then they inherently lose that responsibility and hence consequently sovereignty. So the international community can step in. It was often used as the mandate for humanitarian interventions in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I think you're completely right that it's been very poorly enforced. I don't think it's been consistent. But again, I want people to think about this, right? Like, it's sort of like saying EAs are supposed to give money effectively, but often we don't. Like, if you think of any rule that's very recently been introduced, like ineffective application, I think is an argument for structural reform over it inherently not working. And I think this is sort of my problem with the discussion on state sovereignty generally. And this is the last thing I'll say and I'll end on. This is the first step in thinking about this in the context of the EA community, right? So it will have many, many, many more questions devoted to it than like most other things would. And I estimate that like, making this actually defensible, like for instance, tractable for states, requires like millions of pages of research, not just a presentation from like an idiot with a laptop in this fellowship, right? So I think it's important for us to start thinking about this. So the bar here for me is how much money does the EA community put into thinking about this versus say the alignment problem, 0.0001%. Can it be higher? Probably. So not to punt on the question, I think because I have less time and we can talk about this offline, this very interesting things happening with the R2P right now, with what states can and cannot be willing to do. But I think my general answer is we should probably put a bit of money to think more about it.